This is the Balancing Act by Security Compass, your guide to going fast while staying safe in today's digital world. Today, Rohit Sethi from Security Compass is joined by David Fairman, Chief Security Officer at Netskope, to understand the concept of cyber-physical systems and how these are transforming the way we interact with engineered objects and infrastructure. We will also delve into the security concerns for cyber-physical systems as they play an increasingly vital role in critical infrastructure and can cause massive damage in the event of a cyber attack. In addition, David will talk about the use of these systems in the financial services sector, drawing from his experience.
Well, David, thank you for joining. Great to talk to you again.
Yeah, good to see you, Rohit. It's been a while. It's really great to catch up.
Awesome. Well, let's start with understanding from your perspective, what is a cyber physical system?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think it's good for us to sort of level set that in terms of this conversation. So I think a lot of people sort of think of the IoT and OT world and how does that come together, and we've got the integrated security model. But I think, sort of the broad understanding of cyber physical systems, it's really those systems that are more engineered or orchestrated for sensing, computational control, networking, analytics, and how all that interacts in the physical world. So, some of those key things, if I think about it, how does that interact with the physical world? We're seeing smart cities, we're seeing smart cars, we're seeing, think about the control systems for critical infrastructure with oil and gas, with water systems. How is that all coming together, and how does that have potential physical ramifications? So that's really what we're talking about when we're thinking about, at least when I think about cyber physical systems.
Well, yeah, that's meaty stuff, and I think things that we all are very interested in this industry. What kinds of risks do cyber physical systems pose to our society, for organizations, for consumers, for society at large?
Yeah, look, I think that the risks are much greater than probably how we've thought about cyber risk previously, because of that physical harm or the potential physical harm outcome. We've seen a number of examples, or at least one example recently, I think, in the past couple of months, where there was a death related in a hospital as a result of a ransomware attack, right? When you start thinking about internet connected devices and the potential vulnerabilities that they can have and how they can be exploited, and those devices are reliant on providing some sort of critical service, whether that's electricity, whether it's water supply, capabilities, that is where it becomes a challenge, right? So coming back to your question, I think the risks are more, the outcome, the impact of that risk is much more greater these days. Yeah,
no, I totally agree. So you have a lot of experience in the banking sector. What lessons can we take from what you saw in the banking sector, which is often at the forefront of cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a good point. It is, and I think there's a number of different things that we can learn about. One, I think financial services, to your point, often at the forefront. They have good methodologies, they have good processes, they have discipline and rigor around how they do certain things. At least, on the broadly speaking, they're probably the most mature in that space. I think that's what we need when we start thinking about these more, critical infrastructure related type systems. So how do we bring that level of rigor, discipline, framework, and best practice into the development and creation and support and operations of those systems, I think is one thing. And I think probably the other big thing is the fusion centers. Right now, if you think about the banks, that there's been a big push in banks, and not just within financial services, probably some government industries and some other sectors, but particularly in the banks, around bringing their fraud, physical, cybersecurity, intelligence teams together underneath one integrated front to back security operating model. And I think that's probably some of the learnings we can get from that, particularly when we're talking about physical security systems or things that are physically securely related. Coming back to that cyber element, I'll give you an example of my previous role when I was at National Australia Bank. I was the enterprise security officer there, and I had everything from fraud, physical security, exec protection, cyber, intelligence, etc., all underneath my remit. And a lot of our physical security devices or systems for our banks, for alarm systems, for our executive protection, for not only alarm systems, video surveillance cameras, etc., all IP connected, right, and internet connected in some way, shape, or form. Now, those things are pretty critical. You need to make sure that they're as robust and as protected, but they're not necessarily always managed by the technology teams. They're sort of outsourced, and the operating model or the way that those things are supported are very, very different, but they're just as vulnerable. And actually what we ended up doing is figuring out how we were bringing that in-house and really uplifting the management and the rigor around the protection and monitoring of those systems. Because a lot of those organizations that come from that physical world don't necessarily have the understanding of the cyber and the technology world, and maybe not as mature in their thinking around that. So I think that's probably, somewhere where the broader industry can learn from financial services, particularly once we start talking about that fusion center concept.
So interesting. So, maybe just to build on that a little bit, you mentioned you did that at National Australia Bank. Did you find that's a trend happening across banking? And how do you make the business case for something like that? Sounds like it could be more expensive, maybe not, but depends, I guess, on how you implement it.
Yeah, look, great. Look, there's definitely an impetus for it across the industry. National Australia Bank was the first bank in Australia to go down that path. But in my experience in the US and the UK, there's definitely a lot of financial services organisations that have gone down that path. Citigroup, JP Morgan, RBS, Barclays have definitely gone down that path, just to name a few. And if I think about RBS, actually, to be honest, in my RBS days, in the late 2000s and into 2010, 2011, I worked for Security and Fraud, which had all that underneath one roof, underneath a security and fraud director or director of security and fraud, which had physical and everything together. So it's actually been around for quite some time, but I think it's just becoming more prevalent now because people are really starting to see that connection. So yeah, look, definitely some momentum in that space.
Okay, and you mentioned at the tail end there, the previous question, a fusion center. So can you elaborate a little bit more on that? What is a fusion center and why is it?
Look, this is where I think we get the strategic advantage, if you want to call it that, but the material outcomes. If you think about those various worlds, and I call them worlds, we can call them disciplines, we can call them streams, whether it's the fraud, the physical security, the cyber security and intelligence teams, very much traditionally they could have been managed in very disparate organizations, very disparate teams. Those data sets are disparate. The fusion center, for me, my definition of a fusion center is how do you bring all those disparate data sets together onto one big data platform and then start to understand the patterns and the correlations between activity that's happening in your ecosystem. And understanding, and therefore by bringing all that together and doing that sort of leveraging data science in terms of clustering analysis, machine learning, etc., to identify patterns and anomalies that you probably wouldn't have seen before because those data sets were disparate.
Right.
I think it becomes very, very advantageous, and you'll learn things about your environment, and you'll start to identify things that would have just flown under the radar before that just would not have been visible. Right? It increases your visibility, but it also increases the situational awareness. You know what's going on at a point in time, and you're starting to monitor that in a lot more real time. And you look at a very mature fusion center. It's just not looking at that data. It's looking at external events. It's looking at external current events. It's looking at weather and natural disaster events. So you can start to overlay, what does this mean to me from a resiliency perspective for my organization? So all those things start to come together and culminate to give an organization a much more richer visibility, much more richer insights, and allow them to build and operate a much more resilient organization.
That's pretty cool. I think
actually,
it's a big trend.
One thing I didn't answer there for you, you asked about it could be more expensive in your question. Look, I think there's actually synergies to be realized, right? Because what you will see is when those organizations are very disparate and those teams aren't really working together, or you don't really have a good cross-function operating model, there's a lot of handoffs, there's a lot of duplication. So if you do it right, and you structure it organizationally, and you make this a really data-driven, intelligence-led capability, I actually think that there can be some synergies and some cost savings, but it takes effort and it takes time.
And it sounds to me like one thing it would definitely take is the right skills, which is probably one of the core challenges if you to get that done.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's funny, like I used to say in a few of my teams, or this comment will resonate with them, that they've heard this before. You'll have cyber teams become fraud experts. You'll have physical teams become cyber experts. And you start to cross-pollinate that skill set, which is actually great for an organization, because you're building out that capability and uplifting that skill set, on a much broader platform than you were before.
Yeah, no, that's pretty interesting perspective. That's a good way to think about it. So coming back to the concept of a cyber physical system, how important is it to build security, privacy, and compliance into the design of cyber physical systems?
Yeah, look, I think it's more important now than ever before. And I think it comes back to the point I made at the start of the conversation, which is around, when we're talking about cyber physical systems, we're really talking about, the potential for physical harm, threat, life-threatening situations. I mentioned that example about where somebody died as a result of a ransomware attack in a hospital, right? We're talking about people, physical harm and potential life-threatening conditions. So if there's ever been a motivation for us to think about how do we design systems securely, this is the time to be doing it. And if you think, and actually I was reading an article around that Gartner predicts that the financial impact of cyber physical system attacks resulting in fatal casualties is going to reach over 50 billion by 2023. That's without even taking into the actual value of human life. That's just as a result of the cost, compensation, litigation, insurance, regulatory fines, etc. So that's something that we need to be thinking about as an industry, and making sure that we're solving for this more so than ever before. That's
a big number.
It is.
And I imagine it's only going to get bigger over time. It's interesting to me, the whole concept of building security in as a need. We think about some of the other standards, laws, requirements that have come out over the past couple of decades. And this is maybe from my perspective, because this is the area I live and breathe on a daily basis, but it's interesting to me to see how many best practice standards and frameworks totally miss the concept of building security into products. And so, for example, I was talking to a regulator for a energy sector regulator, let's say, and it was a pretty critical energy sector regulator, and they had modeled their security program off the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is a really good, robust framework.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Right. But it's about overall cybersecurity. And so,
capability.
It doesn't really go into concepts of product security, which I think is a relatively new emergent area. I mean, it's been around for a while, but it's starting to gain a little bit of I'd say independence from cybersecurity. So anyway, those concepts weren't introduced at all. And so there were people, introducing new standards to the energy sector. And, unless this is in the past few years, it's not decades ago, that totally missed this concept of that the products should be secure.
Look, I think you're right. I think there's definitely been a growth towards that. And you can sort of liken a good analogy is the Energy Star rating that you get for products, right? So this product gives you 4-star energy rating versus this product gives you a 2-star energy rating. So I think that product specific benchmarking or indication of standards, we're going to start to see that over time. And it's interesting. I was actually fortunate enough to be part of the Australian Cybersecurity Strategy 2020 think tank that was stood up here, and the Australian government's just released that, and part of those conversations in those workshops were around cybersecurity standards for products, and what role does government need to play around that, and where does industry play a role around that. We're definitely starting to see that, and what we will see, I think it'll be the same thing as I said. Your washing machine gives you a 4-star energy rating. Well, your washing machine will start to give you a 4-star security rating, right? It's only a matter of time before we get there.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, one of the things that's already happened is this concept of the ISA secure designation, the ISA 62443, and that's really the industrial IoT sector, which you're starting to see companies certify against that standard, and eventually you just won't be able to get customers unless meet that minimum standard.
And I think it'll be interesting to see how that gets regulated too over time, right? Yeah. So if you think of like California released a few years ago their IoT regulation, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But that was a little bit, I don't want to say loose, but it was nebulous in terms, it's like everything in terms of you have to provide reasonable levels of standards. So define reasonable, let's define reasonable. What does reasonable mean? And that means different things to different people. These standards that you're talking about are going to that next level of detail. They're becoming very, very specific, right? Yeah. So they're setting a clear standard. And I think that's where it'll be interesting to see how regulation and industry best practice starts to converge and how that starts to come together over time. And therefore, it will change behaviours in terms of how products are built and how organisations think about that product design.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think absent of that, when I look at what happens in product companies, and it's not unlike the rest of cybersecurity, the whole concept of, line 1, line 2, line 3. If you don't have that kind of pressure from a business perspective, like a competitive pressure, or at least a very clear regulatory pressure, it's very hard for people in product security to push the agenda of changing process, for the sake of becoming more secure. That's not to say it never happens. It's a difficult uphill battle.
It's a tough, exactly. Unless there's some sort of, something complying you or driving you to have to meet that standard. It's sometimes the greater good and the right thing to do doesn't always prevail when it means, speed to market. But because it's actually, you mentioned it's about a risk management framework, right? So, a good security person wants to fix everything, but there's also an element around, but what level of risk do we want to accept? Every organization will have a risk appetite in some way, shape or form, but there's certain things that will have much less risk appetite, and that'll be those things that result in potential physical harm.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. It's a harder thing to put into those, quantitative risk models for sure.
Exactly. Right.
Awesome. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share here, David, from your perspective, your experience?
No, I don't think so. I think it's been a great conversation. Thank you for inviting me to this, Rohit. It's been fantastic.
Likewise. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and look forward to doing it again sometime.
Talk to you again soon. Thanks.
Can't get enough of the balancing act? Make sure to check out our website at www.securitycompass.com and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more episodes.